So let's talk a little bit about love. It's Shabbat Chol Hamoed, which is the time traditionally that Orthodox Jews will, and I guess lots of Jews, will go to synagogue and hear the Song of Songs, which was a highly problematic text for the rabbis. The way it's represented in the Talmud is that there was this big canonization convention, what books will count and what won't. And everybody, Rabbi Akiva said, Song of Songs out. And Rabbi Akiva said, Song of Songs in. Not only did he say that, he said, all the songs of the Torah are kadosh, but the Song of Songs is kadosh kodashim, is the holy of holies. So why does Rabbi Akiva say that? Well, it's complicated. Song of Songs is a highly diverse set of different kinds of poems and different kinds of poetic conventions. It makes a literary critic like me say, whoa, gotta stand back and see this. I don't know how people actually read this every Friday night, because people sometimes do, because it's very, very complex. One of the ways that people get rid of the complexity is through reading the Midrash, like all these giant things, into the text and reading it allegorically. So the text, on the one hand, is a story about two lovers. On the other hand, it's a story about God and the people of Israel. Now, what a lot of people do when they read the allegory is they forget that there actually is not only the allegory, but what we would call in literary critical terms, the vehicle of the metaphor. And the vehicle of the metaphor, as opposed to the tenor, my love is a red, red rose, the vehicle is a rose, the tenor is my love. The vehicle of the metaphor here is not just a race, right? You don't just get the people of Israel and God. You have that their love is understood in terms of a love relationship. Wow. So it's very, very complicated. And the rabbis know it's complicated. And they devote, as they do to other books of the Torah, that even later ones, they devote a whole Masechet of Midrashim to Shir HaShirim. And the first chapter of Shir HaShirim Rabbah really it's a kind of book of literary criticism. And I studied Aristotle and Sir Philip Sidney, those old guys who thought poetry was really under attack, and they had to justify it in the face of either philosophy or religion. Now, the rabbis are having a problem here because the text is so difficult. So what do? They create an abstract history. What's the history? In their version, Solomon is the first poet. He comes along and says, because up until now, fear of God had been enough. God spoke at Sinai, we feel his presence through our ancestors, that's all we need. At a certain point, say the rabbis, people needed more. So what did Solomon do? He invented sacred poetry. No small thing. What is the invention of sacred poetry? Sacred poetry is the means through which, through the physical, I can get up to something higher. That really just to go beyond the material, to go beyond the literal. I can transcend the literal. That's what Solomon says. Now, what about the other books? Well, there's a difference between, on the one hand, prophecy, and on the other hand, what the sages called Ruach HaKodesh. So Ruach HaKodesh is like the Holy Spirit. It's a bad translation, but a Navi, a prophet, he has to nullify himself, or she has to nullify herself in relationship to the prophecy which she receives. Ruach HaKodesh, in a way, it's not on a higher level, but it involves much more the input or the agency of the thinker. Solomon is known as the greatest, the wisest of people. Why? Because he was able, through knowledge, to get to something beyond the literal. That's really very important. When people talk about like the spiritual, you have to go to the spiritual, right? It just means something beyond the literal, a meaning that goes beyond what we might have thought. So the Medrash says, up until the point of Solomon, nobody did this. Nobody invented analogies. Nobody had the chutzpah to do so, because it's chutzpah. I studied John Milton, and he's also aware. He wrote Paradise Lost, thought of himself a little bit like a poet or somebody with divine spirit in any event. And he's simultaneously the poet with the most chutzpah and the most humble, because he knows that what he's up to is trying to capture the divine. And that's chutzpah, but he also is very, very tentative about it. That sense of tentativeness is also in the rabbis. They say that Solomon created the first poetry, and they spend a whole parak, a whole chapter, kind of explaining exactly how this works. And then our favorite 19th century commentator on the Midrash, the Eitz Yosef, says, and this is very, very, should be read and learned in every yeshiva. He says, "Va'atam kidorsh chachmas haTorah hu ruchani." That the person, the shorish of Chachma, the root of all Torah wisdom is ruchani, high level, spiritual, divine. The ein b'kochul hasigu, and you don't have the power. A human does not have the power to get to access this. Ki im al yedei dugma, example, umashal gashmi, or through some kind of physical parable. Really, what the Joseph is saying, in order for us to have this kind of knowledge, we need poetry. Now, we are a world that has abandoned poetry. In the religious world, of which I have a large grasp of, there is, on the one hand, in the very, very ultra-Orthodox world, there's the emphasis on halakha, right? It's really comes from the traditions of the 19th century, the Brisk family, the Soloveitchik family. They were very interested in showing how halakha could pass the same kind of logical test as the most sophisticated logic of the 19th century. That's kind of, and that's the contemporary yeshiva method. So everything is very, very dry. On the other hand, there's kind of what Neo-Hasidism and Zohar and Kabbalah, and everybody goes right off into the spiritual realms. And neither, and this is a huge problem in the Jewish world, neither know what it means to read a poem. Why is it important to talk about poetry in this way? Because poetry, greatest poets are like this, greatest painters are like this as well. Rembrandt is the best possible example. At the same time that we feel the physical, we also are aware of something that goes beyond it. The halachist, the legal thinker, never goes beyond just what's written. The mystic gives up on what's written, right? Neither one of them have access to what poetry, this is what the Eitz Yosef is saying. This is what poetry does. Poetry takes something physical, and through it I understand something more. That's what's very important about Shir Hashirim, which we come back to. It's a love story between God and Israel, but as I was saying before, the vehicle never vanishes. The vehicle is always there. We don't go, right, as the mystic would, from the physical to something higher. It's true we go beyond the physical, but we never transcend it completely, right? And this is why poetry is the means for understanding the sacred, because poetry is neither one of the extremes that I just defined. It's not either in a total immersion in this world of Jewish law and text, or transcendence into mysticism. It's actually a combination of the two. That's what the poet does. And Judaism, on every single level, Orthodox, Reform, Reconstructionist, nobody knows how to read poetry anymore. So people should put down their Musar Sfarim, their Hasidic Sfarim, their Balatanya, forgive me, all of those mystical texts, and go back learn the Midrash. And also Halachic Man, also, you don't have to read that either, by Russ Soloveitchik. That's the person I wrote a book on, right? You have to read that either. Midrash is the means, right? It is all of Jewish theology, right? It's all there. Of course, it's not that organized, but poetic sensibilities, and this is very, very important as well, understand that sometimes what we would call for shorthanded truth can only be represented complexly. Remember, Shir Hashirim, which we read on Shabbat, is a story between the love story between God and Israel, but it's also human. And it's what's human, it's what's poetic that makes it true and real.